Good morning, everyone. Today is September 29th, 2018, and this is the John Chappell Natural Philosophy Society. I am your moderator, Franklin Hu, and this is being brought to you by the Natural Philosophy Society, where you can find our website, and you can join us, and we can be found on social media, on Facebook, and we have our own wikis. So if you're on Facebook or YouTube, make sure to go see our web pages. You can find previous recordings of these meetings on YouTube. Give us a like on Facebook, and we're always looking for people to help out with the organization. So we have something called Basecamp that lets you do that. Okay, so today I had announced that we would be talking about this book I've had for a while. The book is called Not by Fire, but by Ice. And this is by a guy named Robert Felix. So I was hoping we'd be able to talk a little bit about global warming or not today. So I was wondering, do we have any people who have any strong feelings about human-caused global warming? Yes or no? So this is your chance for you guys. I want to see who's in the room and what people think about it.
Is it science?
Hey, Harry, what do you think about this?
Is it science or politics?
I don't know. What do you think? Is it science or is it politics? This guy certainly has a contradictory view to the, I would guess, the politically correct stance, which is that all this warming is being caused by human activity.
Well, the real question is it science politics, or is politics science, or what's the difference, and how can you say separate them? Is that really the point or not?
I don't know. Maybe it is. Maybe if it's politics, then the science really doesn't matter. Or if it's science, should the politicians pay attention to that?
Well, the politicians use science to support their political position, but it turns out that the scientists are being paid by the politicians to arrive at conclusions the politicians want.
So do you think that this global warming thing is something like that? Is the science not really there?
How can you tell?
I have a way of commenting on that from a scientific point of view, and that is from the maps of the ocean floor by Maria Tharp. It shows that the Earth has been expanding over time, and the oceans have been forming and getting larger and larger. But what happens if the Earth expands, the total amount of air in the atmosphere is roughly fixed, but you have to put it over a bigger globe, which means that the thickness of the atmosphere gets less and less over time. And that causes the energy from the sun to reach the surface of the Earth more than it did in the past, and so it causes it to slowly warm up over time. But there are other effects too, and that is the density of oxygen. When you have a larger and larger Earth, gets less and less, and that causes the largest animals to all die because they can't get enough oxygen. And we see that the large dinosaurs and other animals are disappearing because of the lack of oxygen. And so there's a couple of different arguments along that line. But the question about whether or not man is doing that, I don't know that most of the people in the physics community seem to think that the pollution that we put into the air eventually gets taken out through rain and other processes, and it doesn't remain there to cause global warming. But we certainly do have pollution, particularly in some countries, like in China and places like that. You see the atmosphere is so hard to see through, and it's hard to breathe because of all the things that they put into the air without making any attempt to limit the pollution they're putting in. And but in American cities that I've been in, it's not too bad, the amount of pollution that we have. In fact, where I live in Maryland, there is no pollution inspection for cars because we have largely Amish people living here, and they ride in buggies, not in cars. And so we don't need any pollution inspection. And we're the only place in Maryland that it's legal to drive a car running on water for its fuel. So we have thousands of people who drive cars with water instead of gasoline. And that car, though, if we went outside our county in Maryland, would be illegal because it doesn't produce enough pollution. Think of that, enough.
So that's Calvert County, is that right, Bill?
No, it's St. Mary's County.
St. Mary's.
Yeah, the first county in the state of Maryland was a colony. And St. Mary's was the first town that was formed. And apparently there was a time when the pollution inspection that they did at the when you got a license for your car was you had to produce less than a certain amount of pollution. In other words, there's a maximum amount you were allowed to make. But then when electric cars came out, and in particular, there was a major manufacturer of electric cars in Florida using the same battery that they used on the moon rover, which was made with public money and not allowed to be patented. They were able to make a car that would go 450 miles on one charge. And I remember I was working at the NOAA at the time, and NOAA's had a certain amount of cars in their motor pool, and they were all electric. And they used this because they considered it was very good, didn't make any pollution. Well, when they got their production up to 1 million cars a year, 1 million electric cars, there was a reaction against them, and they first of all tried to keep them from using that battery, and so they tried to make out that even though the battery was developed with public money, NASA should be able to patent it. And then they finally got laws passed saying through the Department of Transportation that the pollution you pass must be above a certain level and below another level. And since the electric cars didn't do any pollution, they were disqualified and had to be taken off the road. And I remember the entire motor pool for NOAA had to be surplus and gotten rid of. And we went back to gasoline-powered cars. And so I thought that was backward, if you know what I mean. And so that's what we have in our history, in our area here. We don't have those rules, so you can drive even the original, I think it was the Vanguard company that made that car in Florida. Or no, maybe, yeah, I think it was. And they even put one in Indianapolis 500 and almost came in first in the race because they had a little mishap and it caused them to come in second. But they could out-accelerate any gasoline-powered car. And even...
Well, that's quite a remarkable story there, Bill.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll have to go investigate that a little bit later.
What's the thesis of this guy's book?
Okay.
What is the thesis of this guy's book? Okay.
What's his thesis in Fire and Ice, or whatever? Not by fire, but by ice. What's the? Can you summarize his argument?
So his main argument is that what's going to really happen in the very near future is actually going to be a new ice age. Because if you look at the history of ice ages, you know, they come fairly reliably and predictably on a pretty reliable scale, and by that measure, we're pretty much due for a new ice age. So, you know, like any time, like tomorrow, and an ice age which would happen very, very quickly, like almost overnight kind of thing. So that would be his main thesis, that we're due for major ice age, rather than what is going on right now with the global warming people warning that all of our ice caps are going to melt away and Earth is getting warmer. He is predicting the exact opposite.
Does he give any basis for the reason that the ice is going to return?
Why is the ice going to return? Yeah, he has plenty of reasons in his book, so I suppose we could start from the beginning, and because he's got a couple of, you know, fairly remarkable.
That would be a statistical fluctuation back to the mean.
Back to what, the temperature or ice age, or?
Well, if you have a statistical phenomenon and you have a deviation from the mean of the actual, what is actually measured, then you would have a fluctuation back to the mean. So, you know, by the law of statistics.
Well, I don't know if it's really that, but you can see charts where you can see glaciations happen, and you know, and it starts to looking like a sinusoidal curve. Then you can start making predictions about what happened.
Assuming that you have some kind of theory or something behind it, I would take it.
Yeah, well, apparently, you know, there's empirical evidence from ice cores and things like that, so we can, you know, determine like climatic conditions for perhaps millions of years. At least that's the claim. We can detect things like when the previous glaciations have occurred, things like that. But let's go over this.
One of the things that I've learned in scientific discussions is for every thesis that one person presents, there's always somebody else who presents the antithesis of it. So the real issue is, given that for every hypothesis that one can make, there's a person who claims that there is an opposite hypothesis. So how are you going to determine which of the two are correct?
I guess that's for us to determine it, I suppose. So,
well, supposedly the scientific method is supposed to do that, but does the scientific method actually work?
Well, I suppose in the case of the scientific hypothesis, typically we would do experiments to determine whether the hypothesis is true. But for things like global climate, it's like, okay, what kind of experiment could you perform? Because you can't. These things happen over, you know, millions of thousands of millions of years, and there's no experiment that we could actually perform on the Earth as a whole. So this is one of these things.
So in other words, then what they do is they go around, they do a poll, and they say the majority of environmental scientists agree with the global warming thesis, and then they can say that science says that global warming is caused by human activity. And all it really boils down to is a bunch of opinions.
Yep, it does. So I mentioned earlier that, we mentioned things like extinctions. And of course, one of the major questions is, well, what caused the last major dinosaur extinction? So that's what this guy starts out with in his chapter here.
What's his thesis on that?
Well, let me first explain.
Does he agree with a meteorite thesis?
No, he doesn't. So he first notices that around this time of dinosaur extinction, there is this iridium layer. And this iridium layer is found all over the world. And actually, it can be fairly thick, like a foot thick in places. So there is the most accepted theory is that there is a large meteor that impacted the Earth, and that's where the iridium came from. But he disagrees with that. He thinks that the source of the iridium is actually volcanic activity. So he supports this by noting that that there's also plenty of iridium in the Earth, and that there are iridium-enriched deposits around known volcanoes. So he thinks that the main driver behind extinctions is in fact volcanic activity. And he discounts like the existence of the crater in the Yucatan as being much too small to have caused this sort of thing. But one of his main theses is that it's volcanic activity, and this is something that we need to watch out for, that when the volcanoes start to increase, that may in fact be the actual trigger for extinction events.
It's too much of a logical theory, though. That's the problem with it. I mean, it actually makes too much sense. And, but, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, well, for me, I would think that if it wasn't iridium, if the iridium came from a large meteor, that there would be definitely a distribution where there would be just like tons of iridium near the impact zone, and then a very, very thin layer on like the opposite side of where it landed. So, but the thing is that this iridium layer is pretty thick around the entire Earth. You see this on TV. It comes in as a distinct layer, which normally takes like every inch of that stuff is like tens of thousands of years, and we see this visible layer that's in the geologic record, visibly large. And the only thing that I know can do that is if you have I think that's more consistent with like a volcano spewing huge amounts of material up into the air for fairly long periods of time, which would create a consistent layer around the Earth like that. So I kind of feel it is more consistent with volcanic activity than a singular kind of event like that.
It does seem, it always has seemed preposterous to me to suppose a meteorite hit Europe and wiped out dinosaurs. But, to me, that just struck me as the most ridiculous, wild speculation, unsubstantiated. And, so they found some iridium and big deal. That doesn't necessarily mean that if the meteor hit and it did produce the iridium, then all you have is a statistical coincidence. But you don't really have a causal connection. You just have a statistical coincidence. So to me, to me, it's not really a scientific argument. It's just speculation.
So the other argument is that, the dinosaur extinction 65 million years ago wasn't the only extinction. Extinctions seem to happen on a purely periodic basis, almost like clockwork. So it couldn't be that there's a meteor that comes in at exactly 23 million years, like clockwork.
Is that a thesis he presents in his book?
Yeah, that's basically one of the theses. So that's basically his chapter 1 and his chapter 2, saying that, what caused iridium and what causes the what causes the extinctions. Now, the other thing that he notices is that at every extinction, sea levels fall quite a bit. So the only way that the sea level can fall that much is if all the water is being locked up as ice. So he feels that the main cause of the extinction event is actually climate change, where everything goes into an ice age, and that tends to kill everything. So it's something like the volcanoes start up, that blackens the sky. Almost immediately, a gigantic amount of snow falls, and he's talking like several hundred feet of snow could possibly fall in a matter of days. Like 9 stories of snow could possibly fall in a day. If you ever saw that movie, The Day After Yesterday, Day After Tomorrow, I think, they show some scenario that is like that, where just all of a sudden, one day everything is fine, the next day it's frozen wasteland. Now, one of the pieces of evidence that he shows about this, and maybe you've heard about this, is that they found like frozen mammoth carcasses that were apparently so frozen so fast that they find these animals actually in the standing position. And apparently they were frozen so fast that it was like a flash freezing process, where the cells of the meat were frozen so fast it didn't have time to crystallize. And there's stories of people like having mammoth burgers and whatnot, because the meat is so fresh that it looks like the animal just died just maybe a few days ago, not 10,000 years ago. But the only way that could happen is if the event was extremely quick. So I guess that's sort of one thing that he's warning about, is that this could happen basically in a blink of an eye. He discussed that the dinosaur extinction event, some people think it happened over thousands of years, some people think it happened over hundreds of years, some people think it happened over 20 years, some people think it happened instantaneously. Because they find all these dinosaur bones, and they find them basically complete. And if that happened, how can that happen? Because during the time, there were all kinds of scavengers, and they would have immediately, if they saw any dead animal, would have immediately disassembled it and scattered it all over the place. But no, we find these animals essentially intact all over the world, which is part of his evidence that this happened like really suddenly. So I think part of the thing here, he autographed my book here. I guess if you buy it, you can get an autograph. He said, good luck during the coming ice age, because apparently we're going to need it. And he warns things like, be prepared for sudden ice age. I mean, literally, like, keep snowshoes in your garage kind of stuff, because it could come very quickly.
There's another explanation for this data he's pointing out, which is propagated quite widely throughout the world, and that is it's due to the worldwide flood, Noah's flood.
Well, he does mention that, although he kind of mentions it in terms of what happens when the glaciation periods end. Apparently, he notes that when the glaciation period ends, like gigantic lakes form behind these ice dams. And there's evidence that when these ice dams break, that it causes just flooding of biblical proportions in the rest of the continent. So, and he kind of, I don't know that he goes back to the biblical flooding story, but he certainly indicates that gigantic events like that have occurred, and it's really the only way to explain, certain features that are found in places that they're only consistent with a gigantic flood, like something like the size of Lake Michigan emptying out?
Well, most of the water that was involved in the flood was under the continent, and it came up under great pressure and went high into the atmosphere and froze before it came down, and it covered all of the earth. And so even when we go and look in deserts today, we find evidence of glacial activity in the desert. And it's been a desert for as long as recorded history. And so, for instance, the Sahara Desert is one of those that has a lot of glacial activity. There's no glaciers there today, haven't been there for thousands of years, but there were some at one time because we could see the evidence of the glacial activity. And because the water is coming out from under the continents, bringing lots of minerals, including radioactive minerals, to the surface, and so your iridium is coming from that. And so we see there's a lot of consistency. So people who are in favor of creation, they will point all this data out and say this is evidence for the flood. And the other explanations for where the iridium and all the glaciers came from that covered the whole Earth is hard to come up with without a lot of conjecture, because you don't know of a scientific process that would create that. All we know today is that the number of glaciers on the Earth is decreasing every year, and it's been decreasing even before we had a lot of technology that was producing pollution and all that kind of stuff. It's quite different now than it was in the past. So,
well, I think he did. I just briefly, glanced through this book here again. I think he did kind of mention that people thought that the water for the Great Flood came from inside, and then it went back inside the Earth, like the Earth was some kind of gigantic sponge. But I think he kind of poo-pooed that idea, I think.
Well, it doesn't go back inside. It stays on the ice melts and stays on the surface. But the idea was that when there was only one continent on the Earth and no oceans, that it was kind of like a balloon. If you fill it with hydrogen or helium and let it go, it goes up in the air and it expands because there's less pulling it together, and that expansion causes it to pop. And that's basically what happened to the Earth, is it popped, and the water that was under the continents came out and caused the flood. And that's what the book of Genesis says. And but in order to see that, you have to translate it from the original Hebrew, and you have to use the scientific method of translation, which is called the root word method. They didn't do that for a lot of the translations of the Bible. So it's they did use what's called the poetic method, and they tried to make it more poetic, and they took a lot of liberty in describing what was described in the creation and the flood. In the creation, it has the continent being above the water, most of it, and but they don't translate it that way. And so it's interesting to see that. But we do see evidence on every continent that they all had glaciers. And the question is, well, why don't they have them now? What caused them to have glaciers when it's a lot warmer now? But we're talking about even thousands of years ago, there were no glaciers on most of these continents. And so we have to come up with some reason why we don't. And I think that reason is the expansion of the Earth over time causes it to get warmer. And so what we had originally after something like the flood is slowly melting, and the oceans are not flooding the world as much as you might expect because the Earth is still expanding. And by the way, the GPS data shows that it's still undergoing a three-dimensional expansion.
Well, this guy, he's got quite a bit of, he will occasionally show some charts.
Uh-huh.
So this is a chart he has of the ocean sea level. Now, the thing he's showing here is that basically our current sea level, present day, that's that bottom line there, is almost an historic low. That basically the sea level has been much higher in the past. Generally speaking, much higher.
That's because the Earth is expanding, so there isn't enough water to fill the oceans as deep as they used to be.
But it does go up and down, and I don't think that the Earth is going up and down in volume, even by that. So I'm not quite sure that that really supports that.
Well, but you see, you have more melting occurring. So we used to have lots of glaciers in the United States in our history, but they're melting, and so there are more waters going out to the ocean. So it depends on when you measure it and how quickly the glaciers melt when there's a certain level of expansion. And the expansion is erratic. You know, what we call earthquakes are participating in that expansion. The earthquakes all occur along the cracks between the continents as far as expansion is concerned. And so when we have major earthquakes, the Earth is getting a little bit larger, and that will cause temporarily the water level at that area to go down.
Now, this is another.
Does this author address the question of does he discuss the majority opinion, if you will? What does he have to say about the majority opinion, if anything?
Well, he thinks global warming is a bunch of hooey.
Well, what's the basis of his criticism for that? Does he address the data, or does he, does he try to refute the mainstream hypothesis or belief system, or does he just present an alternative interpretation?
Well, he currently still has an ongoing blog, and on his blog he points out several recent articles about how the lowest temperatures have been reported in many different places, and that actually glaciation has increased. And he pointed out this article that said that the Antarctica will be the Arctic will be completely ice free by 2018, and obviously that hasn't happened yet, not even close.
Yeah, right.
So he's still active in trying to prove his hypothesis that the Earth is on the verge of an ice age, and that he contradicts a lot of the.
What does on the verge mean? Is it going to happen in 50,000 years, 100,000 years, or 1,000,000 years?
Tomorrow. That's what he means.
That seems sort of strange, but
it should have actually probably already happened. My own personal thesis is if this guy is correct, then the only reason why it hasn't happened is because we've been pumping so much CO2 in the atmosphere that we've managed to keep the Earth warm enough to prevent that from currently happening. And that may be, it may turn out that, the humans are saving themselves by artificially keeping the atmosphere warm. And that maybe, ironically, at some point when it becomes really obvious that we are going into an ice age, that we're just going to basically have to just deliberately pump CO2 into the air in order to maintain our current climate. That would be the crazy conclusion from that. Wouldn't that be ironic?
There's a lot of stuff that you could say, I suppose. That would be arguing that way. The way you're arguing would be to say that the global warming thesis is correct. It's just incomplete in that it didn't take into account all of the information.
Yeah, well, physicists say that the global warming is not due to pollution. They say it's due to the fact that we're getting more energy from the sun at the surface of the Earth, and that appears to be due to the expansion of the Earth, so that there's less atmosphere above every square foot of surface on the Earth, and so more of the energy of the sun reaches the surface. And so in order to have another ice age, you'd have to have something happen to the sun that reduces that amount of energy.
Well, I think his main thesis is that the thing that causes that is basically volcanism. Now the question is what happens during volcanism and what happens to glaciers? So he's trying to correlate extinctions with ice ages. And he does have let me see here, I've got a chart here. Let me go ahead and share my screen here. Now there does seem to be this correlation between glaciations and magnetic reversals. So let's see here, let's see if I can bring that up. So this is the Amazon page if you want to buy his book there. So here is a chart which basically shows the magnetic reversals. And it shows that he's got highlighted in yellow every one of these reversals that corresponds with a global ice age. So it's not everyone, but, you know, like 70% of them coincide with the magnetic reversal. So I actually wrote a article on this. It has to do with the origin of the Earth's magnetic field. So you can find this on my website, earthmag.html. And what I'm saying is that I think that the origin of the Earth's magnetic field is actually atmospheric, because as the atmosphere moves around the Earth, you know, it actually contains a charge. So if the air is charged, which I believe it is, and it moves around, it actually creates a magnetic field. And by mainstream, they think that about, say, 10% of the measured surface magnetic field does actually come from the Earth's atmosphere. So that's recognized by the mainstream. But what I'm saying is that 10%, I think, actually controls the other 90%. It's kind of like the starter field. And once you get the starter field going, then that kicks in the dynamo, which generates the rest of the field. So currently we have the majority currents, like the jet stream, generally move from the west to the east. And if you think about that being like a gigantic coil of wire wrapped around the Earth, you would see that that's consistent with the current orientation north-south of the magnetic field. So what would it take to reverse the magnetic field? I think that all it would take is a major change in the weather patterns that would cause the atmosphere to move in the opposite direction from the east to the west. Now that may be caused by, these, Felix is saying that that is being triggered largely by volcanic events. So, but support of this hypothesis that the magnetic field is being caused by atmospheric effects is that you can look at all the planets in our galaxy, and you can see that magnetism seems to correlate with how thick your atmosphere is and how fast your planet rotates. So, like if you have Mars, which rotates about the same as Earth, but you have much less atmosphere, then that causes much less magnetic field. Or you have things like Saturn and Jupiter, which have very large atmosphere and rotation and gigantic magnetic fields. Or you have Venus, which has lots of atmosphere, but very little rotation. So you seem to need these two things, which is rotation and a thick atmosphere to have a strong magnetic field. So that's another component to think about. Another piece of evidence comes from these two charts that I found. And this is kind of a chart of the motion of the magnetic field around the Earth. And there definitely seem to be some patterns you can see around here, like around the Pacific Ocean. There seems to be a circular circulation around there. And you can't see it there, but there's other circular rotations that have to do with the continents, the placement of the continents. And then if you compare that against another chart of, say, surface winds, you can kind of see similar patterns. Like, over the Pacific, we have a circulation. Over the Atlantic, we have a circulation, which kind of mimics what we see in the magnetic field motion chart, that we see those circulations happening over the Pacific and the Atlantic. So the thing is that if the magnetic field is something which is inherently inside the Earth, then why is it's so strongly influenced by the placement of the continents, which would just seem to be a little surface feature? So the answer would be that the magnetic field itself is strongly driven by the motion in the atmosphere. So that would be my thesis. And one of the reasons why Felix feels that the ice age is impending is because of the quite rapid reduction in the strength of the magnetic field, and it's increased. It's starting to rapidly move towards the opposite way. So we appear to be on the verge of another magnetic reversal, which always heralds these ice ages and mass extinctions. So that is definitely one of the interesting pieces of evidence that he has to present about what's going on here.
So is this book science or pseudoscience?
I don't know. Is what we do science or pseudoscience?
Well, do we have a criteria to separate the two? So
I
is
don't
mainstream
think so.
science really science or pseudoscience, or is this book, or is what other people doing science and what mainstream is doing pseudoscience? How do we know?
Well, part of what you might know is, like, for example, this chart that I show. So theoretically, people work really hard and have good reason why this data is true. So if he's supporting his hypothesis with data, then I would say that that counts as real science. So he does stuff like this. He brings up a lot of this data, which I think mainstream would agree with, which seems to be consistent with his hypothesis. He's not pulling this stuff, out of a hat without any, backing it up without anything. He brings up this empirical data.
Presumably, the way modern science is being done today, the primary ingredient is you have to do mathematics and create a model, and then based on your model, you match your model up to data. And if your mathematical model and your data agree, then you say you proved it scientifically, and that's what science is. Does he do any of that?
Well, I don't think there's any math involved in geology, which is what he's basically doing this. You're looking at geological data. The only math is like numbers on a timeline.
So that makes it pseudoscience according to the definition that science uses mathematical prediction.
Well, the scientific method that you're mentioning is not the accepted scientific method through history.
I realize that, Bill. I'm just trying to point out that that's the way mainstream views it today.
Yeah.
So what they do is if they say, oh, global warming, and a bunch of scientists get together and they say, we're climate scientists because we have climate models. We make climate models, and our climate models predict global warming because of such and such. And then they take some data and show that over a small period of time, 50 years or so, they show that the model predicts what the data shows. So they agree, and so they say, oh, look at this. This is correct science.
Well,
isn't that what they're doing?
Something like that. But also look on this chart, the time frame, hundreds of thousands of years. And well,
their model doesn't cover hundreds of thousands of years because they don't have data to cover hundreds of thousands of years. They only have data to cover the last 100 years or so, right?
No, I think they're claiming they're seeing data that's that old. And but the problem is the assumptions made in doing that measurement of the time have been disproven, but the mainstream science does not want to accept that because it
would make them not being right.
Yeah, the work I've done on all the known major methods for measuring age, most of them are radioactive decay type methods, but there are other methods. The amount of salt in the ocean, so much salt comes down the rivers every year, and we can measure that, and we could look at the amount that's in the ocean and ask how long would it take to get that much salt there. And we can also, one of those salts is uranium salt, and so we can measure the amount that's there and the amount that's coming down the rivers, and we see, oh, it didn't take very long to get the amount we've got. And but anyway, the work I have done on about 40 different radioactive decay methods, they all agree that the age of the Earth is between 5,000 and 10,000 years. And people are fighting that. They don't want that to be known. They don't want the logic. They don't want someone to show that the assumptions they're making when they measure these ages are incorrect. We know they're incorrect, and they don't, because they don't allow assumptions, false assumptions used by their theories to falsify their measurements. And that's basically what's happening, is they're making assumptions that are known to be false, but that gives them the result they want, and so that's what they do. And when you correct that, you see that all the methods for measuring the age of the Earth agree within their uncertainties of what the age is, but they won't agree if you make these assumptions. They're all diverse. And so that's a problem that they have. And I think the problem is that they changed the scientific method for a political reason, and that they're trying to pursue that, just like we see in Judge Kavanaugh's confirmation in the last few days. All the things that are going on, and it's kind of amazing how each party will interpret the facts to fit their point of view.
Well, I think that might get into some of the things. This chapter 6 is like a continental drift, but before that, one of his theses is that magnetic forces, since we see them, in play during these extinction times and correlated with glaciations, is that what is the trigger for these things is possibly magnetic activity from the sun or on a galactic basis, but that he thinks that his main driver for why the increased volcanic activity is based around magnetism. would be one of his hypotheses here. Now he does get into the topic of continental drift. So I would imagine that you could make an estimate of the age of the Earth based just on how long it's taken the Pacific Basin to open up. So Bill, you're saying that the amount of time that it's taken for the Pacific Basin to open up is less than 5,000 years?
About 5,000 years, yeah. Yeah, and that's what is shown on all the measurements on the stretch marks in the bottom of the ocean, which shows the rate of expansion, and we can look at the amount of, for instance, uranium salt embedded in the stretch marks, and that tells us approximately when it was made, and we can actually measure how old the stretch marks are, and when you look, at the center of the, for instance, the Atlantic Ocean, and you go out and look at the parallel stretch marks all the way to the edge of the continents, and you can measure all of them, and you can see they get younger as you get to the center of the ocean, where you have a lot of the earthquakes occurring and things of that sort, which are causing the Earth to expand from that point. So, the people look at the data that they think supports their theory, and they don't look at all the data, and that's not a good characteristic for a scientist to do that, because he's not going to discover truth that way.
So this is the website about. Top of this website here.
Yeah.
But Bill, do you think truth is really what people want, or is it just an excuse that is used to enforce belief so that the political people can achieve whatever it is they're trying to achieve?
Well, I'm writing a series of papers at the moment on what I call the regression of modern science. And I'm not the only person that has noticed that modern science, the major theories are all false after a certain period of time, about the mid-1800s. And what I'm finding is, from circumstantial evidence, it appears that the scientific method was changed from the logical, empirical method of people like Isaac Newton to the existential scientific method, which largely removed the role of logic, particularly in the falsification of theories based on bad assumptions that are known to be false. And so what I've done is I've analyzed what is wrong with each of those theories, shown how a universal electrodynamic force, which I've been promoting, can explain that data in a different way, better than the current theories do. And then I point out that all of these false theories that are in modern science have one thing in common, and that is they all attempt to refute something revealed in the Bible, in the book of Genesis or some other place. And so I find that very interesting, and I've been studying history.
Bill, what is it? What did you say? They all attempt to do what?
To refute, like, for instance, the Bible says that creation occurred about 6,000 years ago. They say, no, it's 14 billion years ago. They say that God created, and they say, no, it was quantum mechanics says it's a statistical fluctuation in the vacuum, and that caused the creation of the universe. And there could be multiple universes, not just one. And then you have, all kinds of theories that have been put forward, and they're like that. And what I'm noticing is there's a direct correlation between what's called the first Great Awakening and the second Great Awakening, which are spiritual movements. They were in Europe and Great Britain and in our country. And in fact, the reason why we have an independent country is the first Great Awakening caused our people to want freedom, and so we had a Revolutionary War. And then they weren't happy with the fact we had slaves, and so we had the Civil War to take care of that. And then they still weren't happy because women didn't have very many rights compared to men, so they got women so they could go to college, they could vote, and they could do all these things. And there's been a reaction against that, and that reaction has caused them to change the scientific method and to redo science with new theories to try and stop the impact of some of these ideas on society. And so I find that very interesting as a scientist to see how that correlates with the changes in the scientific method. And when that started to fail, they went to what's called the postmodern philosophy of science, which says, well, we can't have a university anymore. We must have a multiversity. We need a separate department for each field of science, and each one is independent of the other, has their own journals, and what they discover in one does not apply to another. So, for instance, when the chemists discovered that gravity was of electrodynamic origin, it didn't appear in any physics journals.
So, Bill, I would say that Felix would probably disagree with that. So for example, here's one of his charts here once again.
Yeah.
And this is showing basically the conveyor-like activity of the spreading seafloor.
Yeah.
So he's showing millions of years here, not thousands of years.
Right. But there's bad assumptions made, which we have disproven in those measurements, and they are now measured in thousands of years. And
that would be a pretty fast motion. And I guess I would believe that. I haven't looked at this. You know, they say that this has been spreading about the speed of your fingernail growing, which is not a small thing. You know, your fingernails will grow about that much a year if you never cut them.
Right. Yeah, and the current rate of expansion of the Earth is small.
You could be able to logically extrapolate, you know, how long that's been going on just from the spreading of the Atlantic.
However, we know when there are earthquakes, things happen rapidly at that point. And so we have recorded in history, in both American Indian history and in Chinese civilization, the long day and the short day that's recorded in the Bible.
Yes.
And
but I'm just saying,
that long day was created by most of the expansion for the Pacific Ocean. That's the only way to explain that data. And people don't want to explain it that way. They say, oh, that's just a myth. That has nothing to do with reality. And so that's what they're doing. But in reality, it looks like it happened rather rapidly. Like just a balloon popping doesn't do it slowly, a little tiny bit at a time. When it pops, it goes more rapidly. And so that's basically where a lot of the expansion took place. And that's why the Pacific Ocean is so much bigger than the Atlantic Ocean. And we have recorded events in history, not just in the Bible history, but in Chinese history and American Indian history. American Indians record a very short day, and Chinese record a long day. And
so you're thinking that because the main assumption would be that all of this expansion happens at the same rate, and if you do that, you come up with millions of years. But if you assume that like 30% of the expansion happened in one day, then that the Earth can only be 6,000 years old. Is what you're saying?
Right, and the flood was another time of great expansion. And the Bible records Noah, before he dies, seeing the expansion beginning and creating the Dead Sea area. And by the way, the Dead Sea, according to Maria Sharp's work, is the center of expansion of the oceans of the world. And it comes down and forks to form, and you can see the stretch marks, it forks to form the oceans, the major oceans of the world. And so anyway, if you take Maria Tharp's data, which is official U.S. Navy data, seriously, you have a problem with there's no constant rate of change over time. It's just we can measure the current rate of change, and the expansion of the Earth is slowing down because the continents have separated more, and the oceans are easier to pull apart, and so there's not as big a force now for changing it as there was in the past. And
so I would say
dating
the hypothesis here, because Bill, you're bringing up like the hypothesis that the Earth has been expanding, and that's why we see the stretch marks.
That is not a hypothesis. That is the data. Any theory has to fit the data.
So I'm just saying that this guy here. So this is the chart of the normal mainstream interpretation of how this all works, and that is that any new crust that's created is basically being subducted underneath the continent. So this is the typical explanation. So this doesn't require that the Earth actually be expanding. So
subduction is very minor on the surface of the Earth. Very minor.
Well, he brings up evidence.
It only occurs around the Pacific, because when it expanded so rapidly, there was a kind of like a recoil, and that's what you see on the Asian coast. But it's very minor compared to the other expansion. GPS shows that. The subduction is tiny compared to the expansion of the whole world. And why don't we take advantage of GPS data? We can measure things to the nearest inch, and we see everything is, all the continental plates are moving apart. And
but facts are really not. Facts are only interpreted in terms of what you want to believe, which precedes the facts.
That's right.
Facts are only used to support a preconceived notion.
Right. To take the theory general.
That seems to be basically what this guy's book is doing. He's preconceiving an hypothesis and then making the facts look like they fit that hypothesis. And that's currently basically what science is, as far as I can tell.
Yeah, postmodern philosophy of science and the existential philosophy of science both are used that way, and it's the only way they could accomplish that was to take the role of logic out of the scientific method, so they wouldn't have their theories falsified, because their assumptions that they're making are known by experiment to be false. They only allow predictions to falsify their theory. But then when general relativity theory could not predict Pioneer 10 and 11 forces, and could not predict the velocity of the outer arms of spiral galaxies, they invent another theory to supplement it so they don't have to falsify the theory. That's not the way to do science. You should say, oh, my theory of gravity needs correcting. But they don't do that. They invent dark matter and dark energy and things like that, and it's not the way to do science.
That protects them, and so they can't be proved wrong, and that protects them. So that's kind of understandable. I mean, what else can you do? You can't admit that you're wrong.
Well, how are you going to make progress if you never admit you're wrong and look for a correct answer?
Yeah, but they've created science as being, because scientists say so, it's right, and you must believe it because scientists say so. But if scientists are ever found to be wrong in something massively significant, like admitting that the Big Bang Theory was incorrect, or admitting that special relativity was wrong, then that means that what scientists say isn't true just because they say so. And they could be wrong, and they're not necessarily always right about everything, which they claim to. And so their credibility gets demolished, and they can't have that, can they?
Yeah. Well,
No, they can't.
There's a
getting back to the book here. So his chapter 6 is on continental drift. I think, we can have our disagreements as to why that happens. But his main thesis is that it does happen. That these plates are being driven apart, and one of his hypothesis here is that he says like north-seeking protons drive the plates. But basically, this is an electromagnetic effect that's being driven by basically magnetic repulsion. That's one of his theses here. And then he notes things like, earthquake lights, that a lot of earthquake activity does seem to be related to electromagnetic phenomenon, that, animals do crazy things just before earthquakes, and all of that to kind of motivate the fact that these seismic events are somehow electrodynamically motivated. Now, in his chapter 9, he's saying that the land rises and falls in sync with, say, our galactic orbit. So he's saying that our position within the galaxy is making a difference, and these kind of things can happen like over a million-year cycles. That as we go in and out of our little space in the galactic arm, we'll be going in and out of regions that may be driving the electromagnetic environment of the Earth, which may in turn cause all of these magnetic reversals and volcanic events.
That's very interesting, but how would you prove it in order to demonstrate that it's not just speculation?
Well, I mean, I could understand that, we understand what our position is within the current Milky Way galaxy. We can probably chart our path through it. We could probably predict what periodic events we would expect as we are circling around our bit of the spiral arm. So I believe, people have done that. So would be the scientific evidence behind this sort of thing.
But we have evidence.
You'd have to establish a causal connection between this and, how would you go about establishing? To me, the whole issue of this whole book and the whole issue is, the claim is that there's a causal connection. In other words, because mankind is driving cars and using fossil fuels, that the climate is changing and the Earth is getting warmer as a result of that. So that's a causal relationship claim. And when you make a causal relationship claim, you have to have a physical mechanism that justifies it. And you have to have some kind of proposed mathematical explanation of it, or that results in a prediction that gives matches the measurement results. And that's what they consider science to be.
Well, I think that the evidence that they're trying to put forward. So this is a quote that he has here saying that basically there is evidence that climate, volcanism, tectonic activity, cratering, and magnetic reversals may all be correlated. So that's one of the things we do in science. We try and correlate things to find causation and result. So if you see all of these activities always happening at the same time, then we can say that they may be being caused by a singular source of an event.
Well, there you said the word maybe.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, that's if you see all these things happening at the same time.
And opposed to that is this mainstream claim by a vast majority, overwhelming majority of climate scientists who agree with the conclusion that greenhouse gas emissions are causing climate change and global warming, and that causes the glaciers to be melting, and they've got climate models based on mathematics that claim this to be true, and they compare these climate prediction models to the data, and they claim that it matches the data, and so therefore it's a scientific fact. Notice I said scientific fact, so it's indisputable now because it's a scientific fact.
Yeah, but the other scientific facts, if you look at the historical temperature of the Earth, you would find that we're almost at a historical low. That the Earth has been much hotter, generally speaking, all throughout its history. And the question is, well, what causes that warming? Humans were not there back then to cause that kind of warming. So,
well, it's just speculation. So as a climate change scientist, I dismiss it.
Yeah. But his hypothesis is saying that what's happening is a natural cycle, and that it's primarily driven by volcanism. So one of the things he points out is that, you know, if you look at the type of extinction that went on, is like almost all of the species were wiped out in the ocean, but the freshwater species seem to be relatively unaffected. So he's saying that basically all the oceans, because they started to basically boil due to all this volcanic activity, that pretty much killed off everything in the oceans, and it explains why is it the freshwater species were relatively untouched, because they weren't being boiled to death in this gigantic, I guess, acidic
okay,
sea.
now suppose I'm the lead scientist of the National Ocean and Oceanographic Administration, NOAA, which I guess is supposed to be the leading scientific organization in the United States of America that deals with this. Would you agree with that? And I came out and I said, well, there are alternative theories that look plausible. Why should we accept this climate change theory that's being proposed by the politicians and the political party that has an agenda? Why would he want to do that? He'd get fired.
You don't want to get fired.
Well, my point is, I don't really think science is driven by the facts. I think that's ought to be obvious to us by now. And
well, I think as dissidents, that's probably one of our main hypotheses. But that's why the mainstream don't like us. So we think they're all
because I think the real issue is if you can say that scientific method, you have a scientific method, and the scientific method is supposedly based on facts. Then the real question is, how are those facts established, and what is the method that you're following that establishes those facts? And basically, it looks like they can't really tell us.
Well, I think we're looking at
to be Bill's thesis is that not only can they not tell us, but they're actually deceiving us.
Well, we're humans. We only live like 100 years at most. And so, but if we look at the data within our lifetimes, it's like, yeah, we can see certain things, but we do have data that exists apparently across a lot longer than that. And you need to look at all of that.
So you hit upon the key point. The key point is, and I was trying to make this earlier, which is that as far as the public and the people making the policy decisions are concerned, what's really important is the immediate measurements of the data. And so the news media is reporting here. I don't know whether you've paid much attention to what the weather has been on the East Coast of the United States, but we have had the warmest September on record, and now they're saying that we've had the warmest summer on record. And why are they telling us that?
because you did have the warmest summer. It's
Yeah,
historical.
we did. But did you guys out there on the West Coast have the warmest summer on record?
Well, we have been dealing with like massive wildfires on the West Coast, partially due to these climatic changes, which is causing a decreased amount of rain to fall, and generally speaking, higher temperatures.
So you're agreeing with the global warming thesis?
I mean, certainly, I would say that my own personal opinion is that the weather is getting more extreme, which means that the summers are getting hotter, the winters are getting colder, and this just seems to be some disaster that wipes out some major community every month. It seems these days.
But I could say, well, from my own personal experience in the Washington area, when I was a boy, the temperature was up around 110 every day in the summer, and it went down to like 100 or high 90s at night. We haven't had a temperature that high in years now. And in my old age, why did it suddenly change? It's getting cooler.
Well, the interesting aspect of it is that the reason they can say that it's warmer is because we've had lots of overcast and rain. It's just been overcast, 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 humidity, overcast, clouds, and rain, which means that instead of night and day, temperatures going up and temperatures going down, it's just been staying warm all the time.
Well, the other thing is...
Not hot, just warm.
Yeah. There are 5 countries that are now altering the weather by moving the jet stream back and forth. We're one of them. We have a place in Fairbanks, Alaska, where we have 1,000 antennas that put up megawatts of power. Into,
I've heard about those. Yeah.
Yeah, and they moved, and we caused the Hurricane Katrina, and it didn't follow any weather model. So if you were looking at the weather, you'd say, "Oh, something's really drastically changing." Yes, we started interfering with the weather. But so do the Chinese and the British and the Russians. They all change the weather too. And they're experimenting, and they don't know exactly what they're doing, I think. And so they're causing different problems in different parts of the world.
So they're the ones that's causing this biblical destruction. It's like every morning I wake up to Good Morning America, and every morning without fail, you know, there is some community that's been wiped out the previous day before, right?
It could be, because they did do Katrina, and it did have a lot of damage, and the government never wanted to admit we did it. they kept that a secret.
So it's not global warming; it is human caused, but being caused by all these governments screwing around with the weather.
Yeah. One of our goals was, instead of having to send troops over to the Middle East, we could just change the weather and make it terrible, and so they couldn't do anything. And see, when we put this energy up into the ionosphere, it bounces off like a radio wave, comes down to the Earth, goes up the ionosphere again, comes down, and does that all the way around the Earth. And so we don't even know what it's going to do in other places. We're just trying to concentrate on one place, and that's unfortunate. And Great Britain wiped out an entire city when they started doing their experiments, and they didn't want to admit we caused a flooding, and it just washed the whole city out into the ocean. They didn't want to admit that. So, you know, we all make mistakes, and but some people are going to cite this data and say, "Oh, this means my theory is correct. This is what's happening," and it's something we're causing by ignorance.
I'm just reading through here. So I think we've gone through most of his hypothesis, but one of his main things is that it's not global warming, but it's in fact ocean warming caused by underwater volcanic activity. So he's saying that it's not human causing the global warming, it's a change in the oceans. And that's something we should...
This goes to the issue of, as Bill was pointing out, what are your assumptions? Okay. So the global warming assumption is that all other things that could affect the global climate are remaining the same as we assume in our model. Okay, so in other words, they go back to their base starting point and they say everything has been the same at the base starting point forever and ever. So their assumption is nothing is changing but the parameters that we're using in our model that we say are changing.
So right now, they're just looking at the carbon dioxide, and but they're not looking at, say, ocean temperatures, right? Ocean
Well, it depends on what parameters you want to put into your model. Okay, if you put every parameter that you could conceive of into your model, then your model basically would predict not much of anything because you'd have too many variables in there changing, right?
Yeah, well, I believe so. It's chapter 14, which is called Pacemaker of the Ages.
By the way, Carl Zaffe presented a number of papers basically with this thesis that you just mentioned. Does he cite Carl Zaffe, Z-A-F-F-E?
I don't know. Like I said, he might, but he's got, like, references of
Carl Zaffe published a number of papers. I believe it was back in the 80s, maybe the 70s, that he came up with this thesis about ocean warming, subterranean ocean warming, causing supposed global warming. They called it global warming back in those days, not climate change.
Well, I would think his hypothesis is that, now basically, like this chapter 14, it says that major glaciations correlate with our galactic orbit, said William Forbes of Cornell University. A full revolution takes about 282 million years. And that,
it's real hard for me to understand how that could be the case other than a statistical coincidence. I mean, I don't really see what possible galactic orbit could have to do with it. And to me,
that's what he's trying to say. There's some kind of correlation here.
Well, what would be the physical cause? Okay, an increase in gravity because we're going closer to the galactic center, or?
Well, I think his hypothesis is that it's due to these electromagnetic forces that differ. So as the Earth is passing through this various like say our distance from the galactic center varies from about 32,000 light years when we're closest to about 38,000 light years when we're furthest away. So I could believe we could probably figure that out. So we are approaching our closest position right now, and we'll reach it within 8 million years. And so previous glaciation occurred about every 140 million years. A causal relationship appears plausible. Now, all these things don't all exactly match up, I don't think, but that's the plausible initial cause. So they're saying that so this is the way it would happen, according to his book here, is that the Earth passes into a region of the galaxy which causes the electromagnetic environment to cause increased volcanism, which increases the temperature of the oceans, which changes the weather, and the change in the weather causes the reversal in the magnetic field, and we get a sudden glaciation due to all these volcanoes suddenly spewing out ash and darkening the world like a nuclear holocaust would. And that is what plunges the Earth into these extinction events.
Well, I think volcanism is much more, kind of from my perspective, volcanism makes more sense as far as causing a cycle of change than any of, that seems really kind of sensible. But why?
You might want to read his book. It's like I said, it's an interesting read.
Well, see, he assumes
well, like I said, I mean, Carl Zappi already, suggested that idea many years ago. And I guess the question I would ask at this point, since we're coming to the end, what does he say in his conclusions, and what does he recommend as a course of action, if any?
Yes, here's his, his course of action. Repent, repent, repent. That's what he's literally. That's what he's got here. On the, repent. Says the world will end tomorrow.
Recommending doing nothing doesn't justify politicians' agendas. So, I mean, if you think that global warming's a problem and you can justify increasing taxation as a result of it, then that sounds like a really good deal for the politicians.
Yeah, but he's saying he doesn't really care about that, because he's just seeing the politicians, they're over there playing their games, not realizing that the impending train wreck is actually going to be this increased volcanic activity, followed by what we would normally recognize as nuclear winter.
Yeah, well, that's certainly a horrific thought. But what, if anything, can anybody do about it?
Well, like I said, is that he's expecting the end to happen soon. So, his let's see here.
I mean, what would be plans of action that you could implement? I mean, what possible...
Move south is one of his recommendations.
Well, we already had the warmest summer on record, primarily because it really didn't it got really hot during 1 month, but when we never really had fall. So that's a statistical oddity. It never really got cool.
Now, he did say that pretty much during glaciations, that while the northern climates were completely affected and destroyed, southern climates pretty much remained the same as they've always been.
So we need to move to some place with a lot of area that's near the equator.
Let's see. I know he had some specific recommendations here, something along the lines of buy snowshoes and that sort of thing. But I'm looking for that, because that was kind of funny, right? Because he's saying that when the ice age happens, it'll literally be like that movie The Day After Tomorrow, where it just almost happens overnight. That one day it'll be normal, the next day the entire eastern seaboard will be covered in 3 stories of snow.
Gosh, now I wish I'd never participated in this video conference, because now it's a scary thought. I'm going to have nightmares tonight.
He's saying that could happen because, like, places have received like 30 inches of rain in 24 hours. And if you translated that into snow, you basically add a 0 onto it. So that 30 inches of rain in 24 hours would equal to 300 inches of snow, which is like several stories of snow. And the only thing that you need to have happen is that the temperature be cold. That's it. If those kind of events happened when it was cold, you would get that kind of snow event over a 24-hour period of time.
Well, we haven't had any cold. We had a brief cold snap last night, so that doesn't really scare me right now.
But suppose you had like a hurricane.
We're desperately wanting summer to be over.
If you had like a hurricane event, I mean, recently, see, the problem on the East Coast is that you guys are getting so much rain that you're constantly being flooded out. In the meantime, on the West Coast, we're getting so little rain that the entire place is burning down. But if you can imagine that if
that's exactly the point. We're getting all the moisture. It's the distribution of the moisture.
Yeah, if you can imagine, if all that
you're getting too much and you're getting not enough.
If all that moisture came down as snow, you guys would be buried already, right?
Yeah, well, I'm not looking forward to this winter then, thinking about it now.
That's all it would take. But, literally,
So,
kind of being a prophet of doom, saying, this is what you need to prepare for. You need to prepare for this massive, sudden glaciation. Is what's that, and that's why his title of the book is not by fire, not by global warming, but by ice. And that this is what New York is going to look like afterwards. See, so.
Well, I know that I don't really like summer, but it's not as hazardous as winter is. Winter is definitely hazardous.
Now, his other point is that in order for glaciation to occur, all you need is to have the snow from the previous winter stick around. If it sticks around all year, then that means another layer of snow will come.
Well, the bone fracture specialist would really appreciate that.
So it's not that complicated to start glaciation. Now, I did mention that this guy does have a current website here, so let me go ahead and show you some of the things he's got on that. So let's see here. I think that's on my other browser here.
So basically, I need to start pricing out snow blowers. Or maybe that won't really do it. Maybe I need a bulldozer or something like that.
So this is the, so he's got a website here. Not by fire, but it's called iceagenow.info. So, for example, he's got this article saying about 30% increase. There's this science blog here he points out. It said ice, this is one where I said that they predicted that in 5 to 10 years, the Arctic could be free of ice. So that would have been about like now. And that, I don't know about this, 30% more. I don't see. There's a website here that tracks the amount of ocean ice thickness over the past couple of years. And on the right, there's this graph showing what the historical averages have been. And it looks like it's pretty average. I mean, all of the data shows that while it might increase or decrease a little bit from year to year, there doesn't seem to be any major trend.
Yeah, I went to a talk a few months ago, and the discussion was about the icebergs in the Atlantic Ocean. And this guy was an expert on the iceberg watches and that sort of thing. The icebergs come down between Greenland and Canada because there's a flow. And the question that these people really wanted an answer to, I mean, they cross-examined him excruciatingly, wanted to know, are there more icebergs? Or are there more icebergs because the global warming people think that there would be more icebergs? And the answer was, no, not really.
So right now I'm showing, there's this animation here showing the difference between the ice thickness between September 2008 and 2018 today. And you can see the little chart they have there showing the yearly variation. Now, so by my eye, it looks pretty average. I mean, it doesn't look like it's changed that much, really, between 2008 when they're making this prediction and today. Now, it's a little bit different, but that curve is still pretty much that curve. So, and certainly the prediction that this place would be ice-free by now certainly hasn't come true. Now, I don't know if there's more, but it certainly seems to be the same. I mean, here's another chart he has, which shows the amount of seamelt that occurs in the Arctic, and that definitely seems to be on a downward trend, meaning less ice is melting off the the Arctic every year. So how could that be if this thing's supposed to be melting away?
Well, if everything's supposed to be melting away, then the mean tide levels would be changing. My sister lives in Italy, and she travels in Greece and the islands around the Mediterranean. And there are places where there are bulkheads that families have been fishing from the same stone bulkheaded dock for over 3,000 years. And she comments that the global warming conspiracy, and that's what they call it, doesn't go over there because they've been fishing from those. The mean water tide level has not changed a quarter of an inch in over 3,000 years. And the harbor masters of the Harbor of New York, Port of Boston, Los Angeles, Port of Long Beach, and the Port of San Pedro report that over the last 50 years, there has been less than half an inch of change in the mean tide level at those ports. And so if there is a global warming or a global cooling, the water should either be going up or down. But the thing about the Arctic is that they haven't pointed out is that the salinity of the oceans has been steadily increasing due to rainfall washing particulate and salt into the water from the land, and that the salt water doesn't freeze, and it's slowly reducing the size of the Arctic, the outside dimension of it. However, the depth and height of the Arctic cap has increased almost 40% in some places. And so when you look at some of those photos from the satellites and they show the outer dimensions subtly decreasing, you also have to take into consideration that the size, the mass is increased, and that worldwide there is more water. Distilled water is the most common form of water found on the globe. Most people don't realize that the depth of the ocean doesn't account for all of the water that's in relative humidity in solution or dissolution in the atmosphere that's dissolved in the air. And so what happens is that as the water evaporates from the ocean and makes its way into the cloud layer, it's all of that water that's surface water and lakes and everything else came as distilled water at one point. And the same thing for the Arctic and the Antarctic, which some of the ice thicknesses have increased substantially. And this water between the ice and the distilled water may account for why the tide level has not raised or lowered, even though the size and dimensions of the extent of the ice has decreased.
So that's interesting. You're saying that it's getting thicker, but it's losing more on the edges.
If you if a mass is reduced in its, if you take a pancake and reduce its diameter to retain the same amount of mass, you'd have to increase its height. Both satellite and surveys done by the USGS in both the Arctic and the Antarctic, and U.S. naval surveys have shown that the ice is substantially increasing. There was a report prepared by the U.S. military because of McMurdo Air Base down in the Antarctic, that they were talking about some of the installations that they had to keep raising up them up out of the snow and the ice, because portions of installations that were installed over 30 years ago are now under 12 and 15 feet of ice. And it's not because the snowdrift blew in, it's because the whole area, the depth is increased.
Yeah, they're saying that the ice is getting thicker, you know. There's another graph here saying temperatures have been falling for 8,000 years. Cooling. So that's another little piece of information that he's bringing out here. So everyone buy snowshoes.
I went to a presentation where global warming advocates had made a movie about the threat to the Norfolk Naval Base and Hampton Roads, where I live in particular, due to global warming. And the thesis was that the water level was rising and that this was a threat to national security. And they presented this big, long movie, I don't know, I guess it was an hour or so, about all these problems that were being caused by the water level rising, et cetera, et cetera. And after it was over, this fellow that I know, who's an ex-merchant marine captain, raised his hand and said, you know, at my dock where I live, I put a nail in the wood 40 years ago, and there's been no water level rise since, which basically was said previously. And that caused a big embarrassment in the room. They couldn't answer that. Why the water level wasn't actually increasing. But the whole thesis that they had presented was that it was.
Well, I suppose it's a little bit embarrassing for them to say that the Arctic should be ice-free now, but apparently it has just as much ice as it did back then. Pretty much.
Well, the real issue was that they presented a lot of cases where you get a rainstorm and large areas flood, and this problem's been getting worse. But the reason the problem is getting worse is because of development. There's more shopping centers, there's more housing development. And while they've increased the number of shopping centers and housing development, they've done very little, next to nothing, to deal with the water runoff from all of these, from all this development. So the problem is not the rise of the water level. The problem is that they don't deal with stormwater management. Stormwater management hasn't really been dealt with. And so that looks, when they present the case that the water level is rising, the failure to deal with stormwater management makes it look like it's true that the water level is rising and that cities are going to disappear under the ocean. I'm not making this up.
So that's another explanation. Although people are saying that it's not really the rise in sea level so far, not really measurable.
Well, you know, they have all this anecdotal evidence about sailors not able to get to the ships because of the flooding of the streets. Well, what causes the flooding of the streets? The fact that the stormwater has no place to go because they have inadequate drainage. And they're saying, in effect, basically, that, well, this is due to the rising sea level.
When it's actually due to a failure when it's actually due to a failure to manage runoff.
Correct.
Okay.
So what do you think of his entire hypothesis that these climatic changes are being driven by basically our galactic position, and that it's primarily volcanism which causes these changes? Now, right now, it's like we hear volcanic events going around in the world, but not to the extent that I would think that would cause the kind of climate change that we've been seeing, where like the West Coast is burning down and the East Coast is getting flooded. I don't see a whole lot of volcanoes going off at the moment, so.
Well, I don't really, to me, I think volcanism makes more sense than, I mean, that's I mean, we know that when these volcanoes go up, it has a significant impact on the climate. I mean, that's, they had that happen in several instances that, in modern recorded history. So, that seems like that's really something that's plausible.
Well, they said in the first 5 hours and 41 minutes of Mount St. Helens eruption that more carbon dioxide was ejected into the atmosphere than every living creature in the last 4,000 years has, including both flora and fauna.
Yeah, that's one of the things that kind of bothers me, which is, you're spending all this money worrying about carbon dioxide emissions, and, it's a drop in the bucket compared to a volcano eruption. And you can't.
Yes.
So, it's kind of, I think it's more about politics and justifying political, things rather than, it's just my anyway.
Yeah, well, here on the West Coast, where we have all these massive wildfires breaking out everywhere, and yeah, that must release, a ton of carbon dioxide. I mean, more than all the people put together all year long into the atmosphere. I mean, it was enough to turn our normally beautiful blue skies here in Seattle into like this hazy, foggy, worse than Beijing kind of smoke everywhere for weeks at a time.
Well, I know that you may not believe this, but that happened here a number of years ago where we had a fire in the Dismal Swamp, and it's a peat fire, which means they couldn't actually put it out because the peat underneath the layer was burning, and so the peat was burning slowly, and the fumes would come up. And it was terrible. This went on for a month or two, and there's just nothing you could do about it. Sorry.
Yeah. There's one other point that when we look at the carbon dioxide emissions, that we fail to realize that plants, and this is on the subject of massive irreversible global deforestation. Plants, if you take an avocado seed and put 3 toothpicks in it and suspend it in water in a nice little crystal dessert dish, it'll begin to grow. During the day, that organic structure, through the miracle of photosynthesis, takes in carbon dioxide, scrubs the carbon from the oxygen, and then recombines it with the hydrogen and the oxygen to make all the molecular structures necessary and all the molecules for that organic structure. People talk about dead dirt in the San Joaquin Valley in California and different places around the world. Well, where's the dead dirt in this organic structure, this avocado pit that's growing in your kitchen window? Well, what happens is that those plants, when we talk about lowering the carbon dioxide, we're lowering the very thing that is the source of organic plant structures for the flora, and so that these global irreversible deforestation of like the rainforest in South America, because we've lowered or we're attempting to lower the carbon dioxide level, taking away the very thing that's the forests grow with. And so we're cutting our own throat by attempting to lower carbon dioxide emissions for the purpose of preventing quote-unquote global warming, which to date there is no actual evidence. It's at least not that I've been able to find. It appears to be supposition if we were to base it exclusively on the ocean level.
Yeah, well, I think when the book says is that our ocean levels are actually at a kind of a historical low, and it's kind of like we're just that the Earth has been, this is like almost unprecedented being cool. And normally the state of the Earth is to not basically have any glaciers on it. That's kind of the more normal state of the Earth, in that we have all of Greenland covered, and all of Antarctic covered, and all of Antarctica covered. It is actually not a very normal condition for the Earth. But nonetheless, he's predicting that another global ice age is due, like tomorrow. So, but that is literally his party message: repent, repent, repent. The end is near. And literally, that's a quote from his book. So that's his message. So it looks like we're getting close to the end of our talk here, and we have been discussing the book "Not by Fire, but by Ice" from Robert Felix. And actually, he lives in my neck of the neighborhood, so I'm kind of wondering whether I can invite him to our upcoming conference here, which will be at the University of Washington. So I would like to remind everyone that we do have our registration open for our upcoming conference, and I would like to see lots of people there. So, and it's never too early to register. So come on down, come see my neck of the neighborhood. And, you know, maybe we can get some more interesting speakers like Robert Felix on there. So, but I believe that concludes our discussion today. So to summarize, the conclusion is that as far as the Earth environmental problems, that probably we should be looking towards global cooling as being our next big problem, rather than, say, global warming. This is largely due on the historical facts around extinctions and magnetic reversals, and that all these things seem to be correlated. They all seem to happen at the same time, and that according to most of the indicators that he has, that we are due or overdue for one of these rather dramatic periods of times when an ice age starts, which could be very suddenly. But his book is readily available on Amazon. It's an interesting read. Well, I've only been able to cover just a tiny fraction of what's in his book there. All right, so, but I believe that will do it for today's episode. And don't anyone worry about what's going to happen tomorrow. Just buy some snowshoes. Make sure your roof is really strong and move south. Okay, so. But thank you all for your participation, and hope to see you next week.